Hello and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Recently, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our staff, help them cover their living expenses, and continue bringing you these adventures. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description and pinned comment. We came to their floating paradise with empty hands and open arms. We brought no rifles, no energy blades, and no threats of violence. But humanity has a very specific definition of peace, one written in the cold calculus of survival. When the gods of the galaxy invite you to lay down your mind, you do not bring a speech. You bring the storm. The Ethalgard Empire did not announce its presence with the thunder of descending dreadnoughts or the blinding flash of orbital bombardments. They were a supreme race, entities existing as cascading ribbons of semi-energy, far above the crude limitations of flesh and bone. They viewed organic life the way a human might view a clumsy, struggling insect. When they extended their invitation for Earth to join the Grand Accord at Auravalis, a gargantuan floating metropolis drifting within the violent atmosphere of a gas giant. They used no conventional communication frequencies. Instead, they sent a song. It was a telepathic area that swept across the globe in a single rotation. For one night, 8 billion human beings shared the exact same dream. They saw a crystal sky, bathed in eternal twilight, where every sorrow was instantly washed away by an ocean of pure, undeniable harmony. It was a promise of absolute peace, an end to the agonizing struggle of existence. To the masses, it was salvation. To the leaders of Earth, listening in cold, underground bunkers, it was the most terrifying act of aggression in human history. Humanity's countermove was calculated with brutal pragmatism. They did not send their most eloquent orators or their most empathetic peacemakers. They chose Francis Burton to serve as the supreme plenipotentiary ambassador. Burton was a man in his middle 50s whose organic frailty had long been replaced by synthetic resilience. His biological eyes were gone, lost to a catastrophic orbital tether failure many years prior. In their place sat twin optical sensors burning with a faint, relentless amber light. The same disaster that took his sight had brutally traumatized his cerebral cortex. His thoughts were no longer a flowing river. They were a fragmented, shattered landscape. To any telepathic entity foolish enough to reach into his consciousness, Burton's mind was a hostile wasteland of dead zones and screaming static. Following him was a carefully curated delegation of exactly 50 diplomats. On the crisp, digital parchment of the official manifest, they were celebrated as the finest minds of their generation, listed as esteemed scholars, delicate artists, and visionary biologists. The reality was a masterpiece of deception. They were the null minds. Each man and woman in the retinue possessed unique neurological abnormalities. Some had congenital defects that scrambled their brainwaves into erratic storms. Others had undergone heavy, invasive cybernetic grafting that encased their organic thoughts in impenetrable Faraday cages of digital noise. Together, they were a walking void in the psychic spectrum, an ugly, chaotic smear on the beautiful canvas of the Ethalgard's universal consciousness. Their luggage reflected this silent defiance. As they prepared to depart, Ethalgard sensory grids swept their vessel for any sign of hostility. The scans returned completely empty. The human delegation carried 0 plasma projectors, 0 kinetic firearms, and 0 microscopic neurotoxins. Their only significant cargo consisted of massive, brutalist metal cylinders. These were politely declared as industrial atmospheric purifiers and localized pressure regulators. Burton's office formally requested permission to bring these colossal civilian devices, stating, They are absolutely vital to help our fragile human biology adapt to the crushing, barometric realities of your magnificent city. The ethalgard, blinded by their own transcendent arrogance, granted the request immediately. They could not conceive of a threat that did not glow with raw, measurable energy. The voyage through the black, silent gulf of space lasted exactly 3 weeks. Aboard the diplomatic transport, there was no celebration, no nervous anticipation of meeting the gods of the galaxy. It was a tomb of quiet, mechanical preparation. While the diplomats of 100 other subjugated worlds had undoubtedly spent their journeys practicing tearful speeches of gratitude, Francis Burton did not utter a single word of his address. He confined himself to his dimly lit quarters. For 4 hours every single day, he connected his neural ports directly into the ship's acoustic drives, flooding his brain with raw, unfiltered white noise. It was a deafening, abrasive torrent of acoustic violence that would have shattered a normal psyche. But for Burton, it was a necessary ritual. He was washing away the lingering, sweet residue of the alien song, scouring his mind until nothing remained but cold, razor-sharp logic, preparing himself for the elegant nightmare waiting at the end of their journey. The diplomatic vessel plunged through the outer stratosphere of the gas giant, trading the cold vacuum of space for a swirling, tempestuous maelstrom of violet and gold clouds. Lightning, the size of continents, danced in the deep, crushing atmosphere below, yet high above those primordial storms. Aura Valis hung like a suspended crown jewel. It was not built with girders or rivets. It was grown, a sprawling, impossible masterpiece of luminescent biocrystal. The floating city drifted smoothly on the atmospheric tides. There were no defensive perimeters, no armored battlements, and absolutely no heavily armed patrol craft buzzing through the airspace to intercept them. The architecture itself seemed to sing a continuous, mesmerizing lullaby. As the Earth vessel extended its landing struts, the very air vibrated with a melodic hum that resonated through the thick hull plates, seeping directly into the marrow of every human aboard. The ethalgard did not wait on the crystalline docks with honor guards or military bands. They offered a greeting far more intimate and infinitely more invasive. The entities themselves were towering silhouettes of cascading, semi-solid light, shifting elegantly between shades of azure and blinding white. The moment the ship's airlock hissed open, the delegation was physically struck by an invisible wall. It was the frequency of resonance. This was a biomagnetic wave meticulously engineered to induce absolute, paralyzing euphoria. It swept over the humans, a warm, golden tide designed to instantly wash away all fear, all malice, and the very concept of self-defense. To a normal, unprotected organic mind, it would have triggered an instant, blissful surrender. For Francis Burton and his 50 null minds, it was sheer, agonizing torture. Deep beneath their skulls, microscopic inhibitor chips screamed in digital agony as they were pushed past their safety limits to 120% of their operational capacity. The cybernetics fought a desperate, invisible war against the melodic onslaught, working frantically to anchor the humans to their chaotic individuality, so they would not simply dissolve into the planetary hive mind. Burton stepped onto the glowing platform, forcing his artificial amber eyes to widen in feigned wonder. He let his shoulders slump and his hands fall open, acting as if he were entirely overwhelmed by the sheer majesty of his hosts. His delegation followed his lead perfectly, mimicking the slack-jawed, tearful awe of the utterly defeated. Soon, they were escorted to their designated diplomatic residence, a sprawling, open-air complex of shimmering, translucent spires that offered terrifying, panoramic views of the swirling clouds thousands of miles below. It was here, within this gilded cage, that Burton observed the true face of the Grand Accord. The communal gardens and floating walkways were filled with representatives from dozens of other alien species who had already signed the treaty in the preceding decades. They were a breathtaking menagerie of interstellar diversity, ranging from towering, multi-limbed reptilians to delicate, avian humanoids with iridescent feathers. Yet, as Burton watched them glide through the crystal corridors, a profound sickness settled in his stomach. They all moved to the exact same phantom rhythm. They were unfailingly polite, exchanging endless pleasantries in hushed, musical tones. They never argued over trade routes or borders. They never showed a single flicker of impatience, anger, or sorrow. But when Burton looked closely into their eyes, the sheer terror of their existence crystallized. Their gazes were perfectly clear, but completely devoid of a soul. They were empty vessels, smiling, breathing husks, moving on invisible puppet strings, perfectly compliant and entirely dead inside. This was the eternal gift the ethalgard offered the galaxy, a peace achieved by erasing the person. Later that afternoon, the chief of Earth's technical detail approached an ethalgard overseer. The human coughed weakly, leaning heavily on a metal cane, playing the part of a fragile, atmospheric-dependent organism failing under alien conditions. Our primitive biology is failing under the ambient pressure and chemical composition of your beautiful city, the technician rasped, his voice trembling with beautifully manufactured fatigue. We urgently request permission to deploy our 4 primary atmospheric purifiers at the main structural anchor points of the city foundation. We must circulate a breathable, pressurized pocket for our survival through the night. The ethalgard entity, shimmering in its cascade of arrogant light, did not even bother to consult a security council or run a background simulation. The supreme beings merely swept their passive sensors over the massive, brutalist metal cylinders the humans had dragged from their ship. They found zero trace of volatile chemical explosives, zero radioactive signatures, and absolutely zero concentrated energy weapons. Boundless in their arrogance and convinced of their absolute telepathic supremacy over these primitive apes, the alien overseer granted the request with a dismissive, elegant wave of light. Within 4 hours, the heavy machines were locked firmly into the 4 vital magnetic tethers that kept Auravalis afloat above the crushing gravity of the gas giant. Night eventually fell over the floating city, though the biocrystals continued to cast a soft, ethereal glow across the silent courtyards. The eve of the Grand Accord had arrived, while his delegation rested in their chambers, desperately recovering from the relentless physical and mental strain of fighting the frequency. Francis Burton stood alone on the edge of his high-altitude balcony. He stared down into the churning, pitch-black abyss of the gas giant's lower atmosphere, a place where the barometric pressure could crush solid titanium into fine dust. From his inner coat pocket, he withdrew a small, sleek device. It was not a subspace communicator, but a highly focused optical laser. With a steady hand, Burton aimed the emitter straight down into the violent, swirling storm systems thousands of miles below the city. He pressed the ignition. A single, ultra-short, encrypted pulse of concentrated light shot into the darkness. It was a silent, desperate message falling into the endless void. He did not wait for a response, because he knew that where the light went, the darkness was already listening and waiting for the dawn. The Grand Assembly convened within the hall of the Ascendant Dragon, a breathtaking, fully transparent amphitheater suspended effortlessly between 9 distinct layers of swirling, hyperkinetic storm clouds. The floor beneath their feet was a single, flawless pane of bioglass, offering a dizzying view of the churning atmospheric abyss below. Above them, the domed ceiling pulsed with a soft, rhythmic luminescence, mimicking the slow, steady heartbeat of a sleeping titan. It was a space designed to make the individual feel infinitely small, to humble any visiting dignitary before the sheer, overwhelming scale of the alien empire. At the epicenter of this floating sphere stood Seraphis, the supreme entity, of the ethalgard. He was a towering pillar of shifting, liquid starlight, his form constantly rippling with impossible geometries. When he spoke, his voice did not travel through the air. It bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating directly against the inner walls of the skull, a booming, perfectly modulated symphony of absolute authority. For 10,000 rotations, we have watched the galaxy burn in the fires of ego, division, and primitive tribalism, Seraphis declared, his psychic voice washing over the assembled delegates. Today, we extinguish the flames of your suffering. Today, the children of Earth, along with our new brethren from the outer rim, shall receive the eternal gift. You do not merely sign our treaty. You become the treaty. The horrifying truth of the Grand Accord finally revealed itself. The peace they offered was not a meticulously drafted document of ink and diplomatic concessions. It was a biological weapon. From the pulsing zenith of the domed ceiling, thousands of luminescent, ribbon-like entities detached themselves and began to gracefully float downward. They were ethereal parasites, engineered from pure biological light, designed to latch onto the cerebral cortex of the host. Once attached, they would violently rewrite the fundamental architecture of the brain, instantly synchronizing the victim's mind into the vast, suffocating ocean of the ethalgard network. It was the absolute, permanent enslavement of consciousness under the guise of ending all galactic conflict. Two lesser delegations from newly discovered, fragile star systems stood just a few paces away from the human contingent. As the glowing ribbons drifted down and wrapped around their heads, a scene of profound, philosophical horror unfolded. For 3 agonizing seconds, the newly arrived aliens wept uncontrollably. They collapsed to their knees, clutching their skulls, screaming as the light burned away their identities. It was the inconsolable grief of a soul witnessing its own execution. They were violently stripped of their childhood memories, the faces of their loved ones, their personal ambitions, and their darkest fears. Then, just as suddenly as the screaming began, it stopped. The weeping delegates went entirely slack. They slowly rose to their feet, their eyes wide, glassy, and completely hollow. A serene, perfectly identical smile stretched across their alien faces as they bowed in flawless, mindless unison. Their individuality had been totally erased. Then, the glowing ribbons descended upon the humans. The light coiled tightly around the skulls of the 50 Earth diplomats. One by one, the humans dropped. 50 bodies hit the crystalline floor in heavy, agonizing unison, their eyes snapping shut, their limbs twitching violently as the parasites sank their ethereal tendrils deep into their gray matter. From his elevated dais, Seraphis radiated a sickening aura of smug, triumphant satisfaction. The apex predators of the cosmos, the most notoriously violent and aggressively individualistic primate species ever encountered, had just been collared. They had been brought to heel, tamed, and assimilated into the perfect chorus of the Empire. But the ethalgard had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They assumed all organic minds were fragile, orderly structures waiting to be struck and tuned like a delicate instrument. They did not understand that the minds they were attempting to invade were already shattered. The parasites plunged into the human brains, expecting to gracefully merge with a flowing river of consciousness. Instead, they collided violently with a roaring, jagged meat grinder. They hit heavily encrypted digital noise, violently traumatic artificial memories, and the chaotic, screeching static of scrambled synaptic pathways. The human minds were toxic, impenetrable fortresses of raw, ugly defiance. The flawless, serene atmosphere of the hall was suddenly shattered by a horrific sound. It was the shrill, mechanical shriek of a biological system experiencing a catastrophic failure. The elegant ribbons of light wrapped around the humans began to wildly strobe, flashing in frantic, sickly bursts of ultraviolet and harsh yellow. They were suffocating. The sheer friction of the human trauma and cybernetic interference created a massive, violent neurological feedback loop. The chaotic energy surged back up the connection, overloading the parasitic entities in real time. Plumes of acrid, black smoke began to pour from the glowing ribbons as they literally caught fire, their bioluminescent structures boiling and bursting under the intense strain of the mental blowback. The burning entities detached, writhing on the floor like dying insects before dissolving into piles of foul-smelling ash. The hall fell into a state of stunned, horrifying silence. The unified chorus of the ethalgard network shuddered in collective shock. Slowly, amidst the drifting black ash, Francis Burton pushed himself off the floor. His movements were deliberate, completely devoid of the robotic grace of the assimilated. He stood up straight, his heavy boots planting firmly against the delicate glass floor. He reached up with a gloved hand and casually brushed a smudge of burnt parasite ash from the shoulder of his tailored suit. When he finally lifted his head to look directly at the towering entity of Seraphis, the passive amber glow of his artificial optics had vanished. In its place, the twin mechanical eyes burned with the harsh, predatory crimson light of a military-grade combat mode. Burton offered the godlike being a cold, razor-thin smile. "Your piece is a little too cramped for our minds." The illusion of divine grace vanished instantly. The liquid starlight composing Seraphis's towering form boiled into a violent, bruised shade of deep crimson. The supreme entity did not speak a command. He projected a shockwave of pure, unadulterated rage. The entire floating metropolis of Auravalis shuddered violently, its biocrystalline architecture groaning under the sudden, massive shift in psychic atmospheric pressure. The soothing, omnipresent melody of the frequency of resonance was brutally ripped away, replaced by the deafening, psychic roar of the dance of ruin. This was not a tool for peaceful assimilation. It was an area of effect telepathic execution. The dance of ruin was a localized wave of cognitive dissonance designed to violently vibrate the fluid within the cerebral cortex until the skull simply burst from the inside out. It was a weapon of absolute extermination, reserved exclusively for the most stubborn and dangerous heretics. The invisible wave crashed down upon the human delegation with the force of a collapsing star. Nothing happened. Francis Burton did not even flinch. His red optical sensors remained fixed on the alien god. Down at the 4 primary structural anchor points of the city, the human technical team had completely dropped their charade of biological frailty. The moment Burton's pulse laser had pierced the clouds the night before, a silent countdown had begun. Exactly upon reaching 0, the human technicians threw the heavy manual override switches on their colossal atmospheric purifiers. The brutalist metal cylinders did not begin cycling air. They began tearing the fabric of reality apart. These machines were actually localized gravity well generators, heavily shielded and perfectly disguised as civilian life support systems. Deep within their armored casings, contained singularity cores were violently forced into high-speed rotation. As the internal drives spooled up to maximum capacity, the localized gravity around the 4 foundational pillars inverted. Space-time itself bent at aggressive, unnatural angles, creating a massive, invisible dome of quantum disruption that completely enclosed the hull of the Ascendant Dragon. Physics clamped down its cold, iron jaws around the throat of alien magic. The quantum disruption field acted as an impenetrable Faraday cage against all telepathic frequencies. The psychic connection was instantly and violently severed. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Seraphis was cut off from the infinite chorus of the ethalgard network. The booming, omnipotent voice of the Empire vanished, leaving behind only the terrifying, suffocating silence of his own isolated mind. He was no longer a god speaking with a trillion voices. He was a solitary prisoner trapped inside a single, echoing skull. The supreme entity staggered backward, his shimmering form flickering erratically as he experienced the paralyzing horror of true cognitive solitude. All around the Grand Hall, the elite citizens of Ethalgard collapsed. Without the constant, guiding hum of the network to dictate their movements and thoughts, they lost all spatial awareness and motor function. They were supreme beings reduced instantly to helpless infants, clutching their heads and gasping for air, totally unable to process individual thought after centuries of parasitic dependency on the collective. The absolute chaos of their sudden isolation stripped them of all their arrogant grace. Through the panicked thrashing of the falling elites, the Royal Guard attempted to intervene. They were lethal constructs of highly pressurized, weaponized energy, entirely autonomous, and designed to incinerate organic threats upon mere physical contact. A dozen of these glowing sentinels surged forward, their limbs forming razor-sharp blades of searing plasma, preparing to slaughter the human delegation where they stood. The humans did not retreat. They executed their countermeasure with the cold, synchronized precision of a tactical strike team. The 50 diplomats reached inside their tailored jackets and withdrew small, sleek metallic cylinders. Upon their arrival, the port authorities had meticulously scanned these items and logged them as standard electronic signature pens, ceremonial trinkets meant for signing the Grand Accord. With a unified metallic click, 50 human thumbs pressed the activation primers. They were not pens. They were high-pressure microcanisters of weaponized, ionized metallic chaff. A thick, silver mist violently expelled from the cylinders, filling the center of the amphitheater in a matter of seconds. The mist was entirely harmless to organic lungs, but to beings composed of semi-solid energy, it was immediate, undeniable death. As the Royal Guards charged into the silver cloud, the millions of microscopic, highly conductive metal particulates aggressively bonded to their energetic forms. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The physical laws of electrical conductivity took absolute control. The energy structures of the guards short-circuited wildly. Massive, blinding arcs of blue electricity violently discharged from their bodies, striking the crystal floor as their internal containment fields rapidly collapsed. One by one, the lethal sentinels fizzled out, popping like blown fuses. Their physical forms rapidly destabilized until they completely evaporated into harmless wisps of ozone and static air. Francis Burton calmly adjusted the cuffs of his jacket as the final guard dissolved into nothingness just 3 feet away from him. There were no deafening explosions. There were no scorched walls. Zero blood had been spilled on the pristine floors of the Ascendant Dragon. Yet, in exactly 4 minutes, the absolute pinnacle of Ethalgard's elite defensive capabilities had been completely neutralized by a combination of basic physics, mechanical engineering, and sheer human audacity. The telepathic gods had been stripped of their fangs, and the mortals now held absolute control over the floating city, even completely severed from the infinite chorus of his people. Seraphis was not entirely powerless. The supreme entity writhed, fighting through the crippling nausea of his sudden cognitive isolation. His shimmering form flickered, but a primal, cold fury anchored him to the physical realm. The Ethalgard relied heavily on their psychic supremacy, but an empire that spanned thousands of star systems did not maintain its grip without conventional means of absolute destruction. Seraphis raised a trembling hand, violently swiping the empty air. A hard, light, holographic interface instantly materialized from the bio-crystal podium. His fingers, composed of pure, concentrated energy, danced across the tactical console, initiating a manual, mechanical override. Outside the hall of the Ascendant Dragon, the beautiful organic curvature of the floating city began to shift. Massive crystalline petals peeled back from the perimeter rings, revealing brutal, unfeeling banks of heavy plasma cluster cannons. Above them, in the cold vacuum of the upper exosphere, the Ethalgard orbital defense fleet shifted its formation, bringing devastating orbital bombardment batteries to bear, aiming directly down at the diplomatic complex. Seraphis let out a harsh, synthetic laugh that echoed terribly in the enclosed space. "You may disconnect my network in this room, but you have no warships. You are utterly alone. With a single command, my orbital defense fleet will incinerate your entire delegation. You will burn as ashes in the wind." Francis Burton did not show a single flicker of panic. He did not signal his technicians to adjust the gravity wells, nor did he order the null mines to take defensive positions. Instead, he simply turned his back on the supreme entity. His heavy boots clicked rhythmically against the transparent glass floor as he strolled casually toward the grand, panoramic window overlooking the abyss. He stared deeply into the violent, churning vortex of the gas giant thousands of miles below, watching the continent-sized lightning storms flash in the endless dark. From his tailored pocket, Burton retrieved a sleek chronometer. He held it up, the digital display glowing a faint green. "Why do you think we used a crawling civilian transport that took exactly 3 weeks to arrive here?" Burton asked, his voice calm, conversational, and chillingly confident. Before Seraphis could process the question, a violent, catastrophic tremor ripped through the very foundation of Aura Vallis. It was not a localized explosion or a shift in the atmospheric tides. It felt as though the entire planet had suddenly roared in anger. Inside the ethalgard tactical interface, pristine blue displays abruptly shattered into frantic, blinding oceans of red alerts. Ear-piercing mechanical sirens, sounds that had not been heard in the floating paradise for centuries, began to shriek with deafening urgency. The radar systems were detecting an impossible anomaly emerging from the absolute lowest depths of the stratosphere, an environment where the barometric pressure and hyper-dense metallic storms were supposed to instantly crush any physical object into microscopic dust. The Great Storm, a swirling hurricane of violet clouds larger than most terrestrial planets, violently split open. From the churning, abyssal depths of the gas giant, 120 stealth dreadnoughts of the Earth's 7th Strike Fleet breached the cloud cover. They were apocalyptic leviathans of cold, black steel, shedding waterfalls of liquid methane and freezing condensation from their heavily armored hulls. For exactly 3 weeks, this massive armada had silently stalked the diplomatic transport. They had perfectly synchronized their telemetry to hide entirely within the narrow, magnetic wake left by the civilian ship's propulsion systems. Upon entering the planet's atmosphere, while the ethalgard sensors were completely distracted by the arrival of the delegates, the entire fleet had executed a terrifying tactical dive, plunging straight down into the crushing depths of the gas storm where no alien radar could ever penetrate. They had waited in the crushing dark, holding their breath, until Burton's tiny laser pulse gave them the signal to rise. The sheer scale of the 7th Fleet completely dwarfed the floating city. As the massive dreadnoughts ascended, their anti-gravity thrusters burned with the fury of captured suns, illuminating the lower atmosphere in harsh, aggressive hues of industrial orange and engine blue. On the bridge of the flagship, human artillery commanders shouted firing coordinates. Massive armored plates slid back along the flanks of the dreadnoughts, revealing rows upon rows of heavy particle accelerator cannons. The weapons had already been spooling up in the darkness, their capacitors humming with world-ending potential. The sky above Aura Vallis was suddenly painted with thousands of solid red targeting lasers. The beams cut through the mist, locking directly onto every single structural weak point, magnetic tether, and energy hub of the floating city. Furthermore, the dreadnoughts angled their primary spinal batteries upward, their targeting computers easily locking onto the underbellies of the ethalgard orbital fleet, effectively trapping the alien warships in a crossfire from which there was no mathematical escape. The heart of the Empire was pinned down, totally surrounded, and entirely at the mercy of human artillery. Francis Burton turned back to face the center of the room. The crimson glow of his artificial eyes seemed to burn even brighter as the shadow of a massive dreadnought passed over the transparent ceiling, plunging the hall of the Ascendant Dragon into a terrifying twilight. "We did not bring guns into your meeting room," Burton said, his voice deep, resonant, and dripping with the absolute, undeniable weight of human dominance. "We brought an entire fleet to surround your meeting room." The towering entity of liquid starlight finally shattered. Seraphis, the supreme entity of an empire spanning thousands of worlds, collapsed to his knees upon the bio-glass floor. He was entirely trapped inside his sanctuary. The quantum disruption of the gravity wells pinned him down. Outside, the particle accelerator cannons of 120 human dreadnoughts held his city hostage. The illusion of divine supremacy evaporated, leaving behind only the desperate terror of a cornered tyrant. "You are savages!" Seraphis screamed, his voice no longer a booming telepathic symphony, but a harsh, grating mechanical vibration tearing through the physical air. "You are chaotic, violent beasts. We offered the galaxy perfect peace. We offered an end to suffering, a singular, flawless harmony, and you have destroyed it." Francis Burton stepped closer. There was no arrogance in his stride, no gloating smile on his scarred face. The heavy boots of the human ambassador stopped just inches away from the kneeling alien god. "True peace is not the absence of noise," Burton said, his voice echoing with absolute, unyielding conviction. "Peace is not tearing out the vocal cords of the universe just so you can listen to your own song. True peace is having the strength to sit in the middle of a chaotic, deafening symphony and learning how to live with the noise. What you built was not harmony. It was a graveyard of minds, and humanity does not bow in graveyards." Burton reached into his jacket and pulled out a physical document. It was not a digital datapad or a crystalline memory drive. It was thick, heavy paper, bound in leather. He dropped the Earth-drafted treaty onto the glowing podium. "Here are our terms," Burton stated. "First, you will permanently dismantle the assimilation network. Second, you will immediately return absolute free will to every single planetary system your empire has subjugated. Third, the Grand Accord will be reformed into a coalition council based entirely on planetary self-determination. No more gods. No more masters." Seraphis glared at the paper, his energy form trembling with rage. "And what if I refuse? What if we rebuild the network the moment your fleet leaves orbit?" "You will not have the chance," Burton replied coldly. "We are leaving our atmospheric purifiers behind. They have been permanently anchored to your foundational tethers and handed over to an independent, unshackled artificial intelligence. If that intelligence detects even a single spike of your telepathic enslavement frequency, it will override the safety protocols. The gravity wells will invert at maximum capacity, and they will crush this floating paradise into a sphere of matter the size of a marble." Trembling, utterly defeated by a species he had considered primitive apes, Seraphis extended a shaking hand of concentrated energy and pressed his signature sequence into the physical parchment. The moment the treaty was sealed, the massive quantum disruption field shifted, sending a violent shockwave across the entire planet. The suppression frequency that had blanketed the city was permanently shattered. All across the floating courtyards and crystal gardens, the horrifying silence broke. Thousands of alien delegates from 100 different star systems suddenly gasped for air. They stumbled, clutching their heads in absolute agony and confusion as a rush of stolen memories slammed back into their brains. The glassy, empty stares melted away, replaced by profound terror, overwhelming joy, and raw, unfiltered sorrow. They were falling to the ground, weeping openly, holding one another as their individual souls were violently shoved back into their bodies. They were awake. Francis Burton looked out over the awakening masses and gave a slow, respectful nod. The human delegation quietly packed up their equipment, leaving only the brutalist metal cylinders bolted to the floor. Without another word to their former hosts, The 50 nullmines turned around and marched calmly back to their civilian transport to begin the long journey home. The galaxy had been invited to a grand conference of absolute, manufactured peace, but humanity had arrived to teach them a brutal, necessary truth, to secure true freedom, and to earn genuine peace. Sometimes, you have to be fully prepared to crush the sky. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story exciting and want to support our team, please consider donating just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the video description or the pinned comment. That single dollar helps us pay our hardworking staff, supports their families in daily life, and allows us to keep creating the best sci-fi stories for you. Thank you for standing by us, and we will see you in the next adventure.